Unfair fees in a real estate transaction? Nah, that can't happen. Stay tuned. I'll tell you more. Hey, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Inside the Deal Through Michael's Eyes. It's a fresh take on real estate and business in general. My name is Michael Renick, and I am your host for this podcast. Most of you know who I am. I've done my background on many of these. What I'd like to bring in for some help to address this is a great friend and also a great attorney, Michael Henkin. I'll do a brief summary on him. He's a man I proudly call a powerhouse of legal insight right here in Sarasota when it comes to understanding the intricate web of legal matters that impact our lives and businesses. Michael is second to none. And we've got a topic here that Michael has a lot of passion on, and I like that. We'll have some fun with this. Michael, what's going on out there?
Sure. So, as part of my practice, I commonly represent a buyer or a seller in a transaction. And a buyer and seller in a residential transaction always, 99% of the time, enter into a purchase and sale agreement. The standardized purchase and sale agreement we have in Florida is developed by a really hardworking committee, half consisting of realtors, half consisting of members of the Florida Bar. And they argue hours on end over each sentence, each word in our standardized contract.
So are you the two groups responsible for giving us some of these things that confuse the living daylights out of me?
We are.
Aha, I've got you guys where I want you. Go ahead.
And so, this contract, and it's really two different versions of the contract, which for the purpose of this discussion, we don't need to get into. But the standardized contracts are put together at great length by this committee consisting of realtors, of attorneys. They painstakingly go through it line by line. They set the standards as to how Florida residential real estate is handled. And invariably, when I am representing a buyer or seller and I'm not the person preparing the closing documents, who's called the closing agent, I see the closing agent try to rewrite terms of the deal, try to charge fees to people to whom they should not be charged, try to add representations to a buyer or seller that they are not obligated to make, and essentially say, I don't care what the state has decided, the state committee has decided that residential real estate should look like. I don't care what the parties have decided that our transaction should look like. I think I should add all of these extra terms, all of these extra representations and warranties, all of these extra fees, because that's the way I think it should be done. And Mike, I
Of
got to
course,
tell
those
you,
fees benefit them, right? They think it should be done. They're padding their pockets. Is that
that's
true?
right. I mean, for the fees, you're absolutely right. They never add more taxes to the state, but they sure as hell do add more fees for services. They allocate the fees for the services in the way they think it should be allocated.
Is
So,
is any of this stuff regulated by the state?
um, not really. These are specific contractual obligations. So a buyer or a seller could certainly sue the other. They could sue the closing agent. But realistically, if the closing agent's going to clip you for $150 worth of expense, it's probably not worth your time, effort, and energy to go and pursue that closing agent for not following the contract.
But this is where, whether you're a buyer or seller, if you're not paying for the title, you're not driving that part of the transaction, you need a broker that understands what the heck's going on, right? A real estate broker, not an attorney necessarily. Attorney would be even better probably. But like, for example, if our side of the deal isn't paying for the title represented by an attorney, we go through all the documents. And if we find things that are out of line, we like the best thing that comes to mind is one time I'm working with a buyer and the seller's paying for the closing costs and the title and all that kind of stuff. And the title company had charged $900 to my buyer. And I called and I explained that no, the seller's paying all the expenses per the agreement. And they said, no, we understand, but our policy is there's $900 on the buyer side. And I said, I'm okay with that. you're going to charge the seller that $900, but I'm okay that you think it's the buyer's side, and you will remove it. And they had to, because it was clear. Is that a good example of what you're talking about?
That's a great example. And it happens all the time. They'll tell you it's our policy, it's our standard. We're doing that work for that person's benefit. But it doesn't matter if it's their policy or if it's their standard or to whom it benefits. What matters is what the buyer and seller agreed to in the written contract.
So you're
Not
going back. So what you're really saying is, so when a buyer puts forth an offer and the seller signs it, that's the contract, right? The offer becomes the contract, and that
exactly.
spells out who pays what. Is that correct?
That's exactly correct. And so the buyer and seller have already agreed upon it, already negotiated it. Most likely they didn't read the form to begin with. Let's be honest, nobody reads
Really?
13-page contract. But we have this contract that's been put together by this wonderful group at the state, which is really looking for what's fair in real estate transactions. And we have that great benefit in Florida that we have this really developed contract that gets rid of ambiguities, that is done in a way that a collaborative group thinks is fair, not looking for the buyer or the seller or not looking for either's benefit. The aim of the group that puts together the contract is to create a fair and balanced agreement between buyers and sellers.
And that's why you have a state approved contract that we use in Florida. Like you said, there's two versions, but as is in what I call the FAR bar, and we don't need to go into that right here, but they're both state approved to make them as clear as possible. If I could editorialize for just a second, they may not be all the way to the finish line when you talk about as clear as possible, but that's another podcast. We don't have to go into that. You being an attorney, I've got to have some fun with this thing.
Sure. So to me, it's not just fees. So fees certainly are the most impactful. They affect the buyer or seller on the day of closing, money actually out of their pocket. But it's also representations and warranties. So typically, the most commonly used contract is the as is contract. In an as is contract, a buyer has an opportunity to go do an inspection, do whatever they want during their inspection period. And then if they don't cancel, they take title subject to essentially everything that's out there. Invariably, a closing attorney will add all sorts of needless representations and warranties to the seller, things that are not provided for the contract, and they just rewrite how they would like the deal to be handled. Sometimes they represent the buyer and they're looking out for the buyer's best interest, but it's not the closing agent's job to impose their own will upon the transaction, impose their own fees, impose their own idea as to what the buyer and seller's agreement should have looked like. A seller under our standard contract is required to say there's nobody else in possession and there's no liens or encumbrances on the property. That's it. Pretty simple, pretty straightforward, but invariably you'll have the closing documents that say there's no violations of any municipal codes. My property boundaries have never been disputed. I've never gotten in an argument with my neighbor as to where our monuments are. All these extra things that create potential liability for a seller, which the seller did not agree to. And just because the closing agent decides they want it, they put it in the documents, they change the terms of the deal. And as I said, Mike, it really pisses me off.
You're speaking from the heart, and that shows your passion for this. Because the reason I ask you to be a partner in the podcast is your focus on doing what's right, and this clearly is not right. It's adding costs to a side that shouldn't have to pay for them.
Right, adding costs, adding liability. The parties have agreed we should all step back and say, we're going to respect the agreement that the parties have made. We're not going to try to Monday morning quarterback it. We're not going to try to rewrite it. This is what they've decided. Let's do what we as professionals should do and help our clients accomplish the goals that they've told us that they want. And they tell us that with their words, they tell us that with the agreements they give us. Our job is to make their dreams come true, so to speak, not to define what their dreams should be. not to make it into something that they don't want, that they didn't ask for, or to try to get them some unfair advantage or impose some detriment that doesn't need to be imposed.
So when you're representing a client and the other side's doing the title work, that what we're talking about, and you bring these up, is it hard to get it done the right way? I mean, they have to give in, right? You know what you're doing, and when you call them on the carpet, they have to withdraw those. Is that correct?
So, in theory, yes. So you point to the contract, you say, this is what the contract says. It unambiguously provides that this is how it is. And then, as you mentioned, you get the absolute BS responses. Oh, this is our company's policy. Really, it's your company's policy to overcharge my client? That does not seem like a good policy for everybody other than you. And so oftentimes it's not just, please remove this that you're not allowed to include. It's, please remove this. No, we don't want to. Oh, it's our company's policy. Oh, but we did this work which benefits you. Let me tell you why you really want to pay us this fee. Let me tell you why you really want to provide this representation. Let me tell you that some third party who's not even a party to the transaction, like a title underwriter, might otherwise want this statement. And none of those things are material. None of those things are what the buyer and seller said they wanted. And it's just not right. It's not right to Monday morning quarterback somebody else's transaction, somebody else's terms and conditions, and just add something that shouldn't be there.
And this is why, if you're not paying for the title, you need someone experienced on your side, either an experienced real estate broker, an attorney, someone to go through this. We had a case, I shared this before the podcast started, where I was representing the buyer. The seller was paying for the title, doing the title work. The title company wanted to charge my buyer, I think it was $900. And I made it clear that the contract says seller's paying all title costs. And they said, but we have a policy that the other side incurs $900 in costs. And I said, I'm okay with your policy. Your seller's going to pay for it, not my client. It's really clear. You can charge the $900. I'm fine. You're not charging the buyer that. And they relented. It was just a BS kind of a thing. And from your passion, I can tell you see this a lot more often than you're comfortable with out there.
And it's 3 times this week. It's a common theme where you have the same argument over and over and over, which should be cut and dry. The contract is not written in a language people don't understand. It's written in just straightforward English. And
well, I'd have to debate you on that a little bit. See, you're looking at it from an educated attorney's perspective. It's probably really clear to you guys. In most cases, it's clear to a layman like myself. But we might find a couple of sentences in there that are interesting. Let me say it that way.
What I find is people become intimidated by things they don't know. So most people don't do real estate transactions every day. So you do a transaction, let's say the other side's supposed to be paying for a fee, but you get the closing statement and you think, well, that shouldn't be my fee. I don't know why they put that on there, but you're afraid to raise a question because you think this must be right if they prepared the documents this way. And
I don't think that way.
You have to look at everything skeptically. Title agents, attorneys, they don't have to have a ton of experience. Realtors on the other side of a deal don't have to have a ton of experience. And in these things, you can't and shouldn't just accept things to be right just because they were written down on a piece of paper, prepared by somebody who looks like they do this all the time.
Whether our side's paying title or not, every time we get the closing package, we go through, we put it aside, and we replicate the numbers. And we have to be able to tie them on. If not, we ask. And many times we had made the mistake, and the person educates us on what we did wrong. Get that? That's fine. But we will catch things like that. I don't know that, we did a podcast recently about single agency transaction broker. I don't know whether any of those different relationships require it, but that's what we do. If we're going to behave in the best interest of our client, being single agents, we are going to validate every single number. Even if their attorney prepares it, there's this thing called human error. And having another set of eyes look at something is really, really important. And so you've got the folks out there that are kind of pushing the goal line a little bit into an area where they shouldn't. They're moving the goal line from the 0 yard line up to the 10, saying it's a touchdown. But this stuff, we've got to get our arms around that. You've got to have experienced people, because at the end of the day, in a transaction, the way I approach business, the way you approach business, both sides have to win. And that's implementing the agreement they sign. Does that make sense?
I think so. I think that makes sense. I think it's empowering your clients to accomplish their goals as they've stated. And I think you can restate this same issue in terms of a transaction broker or single agent that we talked about previously. Transaction broker, you're maybe not reviewing the closing statement to see if your client's overcharged. You're looking to make sure the transaction's going to occur, but you're not there necessarily looking out for your client's best interest to make sure they're not being charged something they shouldn't be charged. Or a single agent, you have an obligation to work in your client's best interest. So if you see a charge that shouldn't be charged to your client, you have an obligation to probably say something about it. And just that one change alone can save your client sometimes hundreds, sometimes thousands of dollars.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to take this a little bit of a side here. It's a simple thing, like, for example, and we've talked about this before, and we actually implement this in a deal where I'm representing the buyer. And many times, sellers aren't aware of what's going on in their association level, their board level, and stuff like that. So we'll get up close to closing, and we, representing the buyer, have gone through all of the past year or more minutes from the board meetings, committee meetings, and things like that. We found things the seller didn't disclose. Not that they were not doing business the right way. They were maybe unaware of it. And because of the fact we found that, and that was coming at them, the seller actually had to pay that. The title company didn't catch that. The other agent didn't catch that. But we did, because that's how business is being done right. Costs today in real estate are humongous. It's about getting them right. Does that make sense?
I think so. I think about looking out for your client's best interest, about making sure that they're treated fairly, making sure they're treated the way they contractually agreed to be treated, and not having any gotchas. It's doing a good job for the person who decided to hire you.
When you behave that way, everybody ultimately wins. And that's what the purpose is. When we go to negotiation, it's about building the rapport with the other side so that they feel they're winners. Because when they feel they're winners and my side are winners, everyone gets more of what they deserve. My side always wins that way. Kind of aside, you talk about rewriting the contract a little bit, not a title company, but we recently had $1.5 million deal and got the contract executed. Everything was fine on both sides moving forward. And the other agent reached out and said, "I need proof of funds from your buyer." I said, "Oh, you do? Really?" That wasn't part of the deal. I can go and ask my buyer, but being a single agent, I'll let him know he's not required to provide those. And the other agent was very upset with me. But when you think about it, it wasn't part of the deal. It's not required to be shown on a cash deal. A good agent would have put that into the contract, right? We write that in there all the time. So just another thing, I went to the buyer and I explained it to him, and he said, he asked me, "Do you want to have some fun with the seller?" I says, "We haven't done the inspection yet. We want everybody getting along. So if you're okay with it, I'd be okay if you sent them to me to send them over to the seller." And we did. So you want to be careful about the whole transaction there. But it is right. It's about doing the right thing. It's about honoring the contract. It's not about putting all this other stuff into it. You said, before we started, maybe this wouldn't be the most exciting podcast that we've done. I think it's one of the best that we've done. I mean, there's a lot of passion in your life and my life about doing what's right. And, we've known each other for a long time, and we've got many examples where we've lived that kind of stuff. You have, and we have. So I enjoy this kind of stuff. Something really jumping off the end of the cliff here, a future podcast might be, Have you ever been presented with the as-is contract? Do you realize it's anything but as is? That could be a kind of a fun one.
Sounds like fun.
So we're going to continue to do this. Michael, thank you so much for this. I appreciate your insight in this. I appreciate your passion. And I look forward to a whole lot more of these as we now are in 2025.
That sounds great. Looking forward to it, Mike.
Take care.